Hi, Twin. So we're going to continue reading about the Titanic, and I wanted to show you. This is a picture of an iceberg, and that's ice. But you see, this white line here is the top of the water. So that's what you would see if you were in a ship. You would just see this on the top. It's hard to point it out. Um, but you see how much is on the bottom? And that's why icebergs can actually be really quite dangerous, because you see the bottom and you think you might be okay by just maybe moving around it, but you really can't because you're going to hit other parts of it. So that's an iceberg. And this is a picture of the Titanic. Yeah. Okay, so where we were last time was, I think, Matt and Emily, they're trying to almost warn people, but when the Titanic was built, people thought nothing could destroy the Titanic, that it was the safest ship in the world. But of course, because they're from the future, they know that that's not true. And in fact, the Titanic will hit an iceberg, and it's 5 o'clock p.m. there, and we know that the iceberg hit at 11:30. So they were going to tell people where they were from the future, and then a young woman, a little girl actually, came up to them, and she started to make fun of them. 5 p.m. "We are from the future, and we'll prove it," said Matt. He pulled his recorder out of his pants pocket. "This is a digital recorder. You can hear people's voices on it." The girl waved her hand as if dismissing Matt's words. "That's just a little metal box, and if you're from the future, then I'm from the moon, and I'm not." Matt turned the recorder on. "This is Matt speaking," he said. Then he played his voice back. The girl's eyes widened. "That's a good trick," she said. "It's almost as good as when I saw a man pull a rabbit out of his hat." "Here, you talk into the recorder, and I'll play your voice back," said Matt. Matt pressed the on button, and the girl spoke into the recorder. "My name is Sally, and I'm on the Titanic with two silly children." Matt flipped the recorder off and on again. Sally gasped as she listened to her voice. "That's fantastic, but it still doesn't prove anything." So he was recording her voice, something that he could do in modern times, but back then with the Titanic, you couldn't do that. So for her, it's like magic. For Sally. Matt sighed. "Look," said Sally, "it's a terrific trick. You two are fun. Do you want to explore?" "Sure," said Emily. "I'm Emily. Matt and I want to go up to first class." "Me too. Let's go," said Sally. The children climbed the stairs to the first class promenade deck. When they reached the top, Emily shivered. "It's getting colder out. I wanted to go swimming, but I'm too cold now. Anyway, I don't have a bathing suit." "Let's go to the gymnasium," suggested Sally. "I hear they have a mechanical horse and camel you can ride on." "Awesome," said Matt. "But where's the gymnasium?" "Let's ask that boy over there," said Emily. A boy of about 9 in short gray pants and high boots was walking briskly down the deck. "Excuse me," said Emily. "How do we get to the gymnasium?" The boy stared at them. "Who are you? I've never seen any of you, and I know all the children in first class. You don't belong here." We just want to see the gymnasium," said Sally. The boy glared at them. "The gymnasium is only open till 3:30, so you can't see it. If you don't leave right now, I'm going to call the steward, and he'll make you leave." The boy opened his mouth to yell. "You'll do no such thing, Arthur," said a plump woman with a booming voice. Her huge hat was covered in feathers, and her long gray coat had a fluffy fur collar. "That is no way to speak to anyone. Your mother would be horrified at your bad manners." Arthur wrinkled his nose at the woman. My mother would not be horrified, Mrs. Brown. She thinks people should stay where they belong. Well, these children belong here now. They are my guests. So off you go, Arthur. Come, children, follow me. And there's the woman right there. So 6 p.m. Arthur's only 9, and he's already convinced he owns the world. I can't imagine what he'll be like when he grows up, said Mrs. Brown. Thanks for letting us stay here, said Emily. It's my pleasure, dear. You children are not harming anyone. You were just curious about first class. I'm Emily. This is Matt and Sally, and we're more than curious, said Emily. We have to talk to the captain tonight. It's very important, said Matt. Well, it just so happens that Captain Smith may dine at my table tonight. Why don't you 3 join me for dinner, if it's all right with your family? They won't mind, thank you. That's awesome, said Matt. Sally sighed. I would love to have dinner in first class too, but I promised my aunt I'd have dinner with her. I'd better get back now. She'll wonder where I am. Thanks for being so kind, Mrs. Brown. Goodbye, Sally. Now I really must sit down on that deck chair while you children say your goodbyes. My feet are killing me in these new shoes. I don't know why I bought them. Mrs. Brown hobbled over to a chair. Sally turned to Matt and Emily. Come visit with me tomorrow again. Emily and Matt looked at each other. How could they tell Sally that the Titanic would not be sailing tomorrow? She still didn't believe that they were from the future. Why would she believe that the ship was going to collide with an iceberg and sink in a few hours? But she was their friend now. They had to warn her. We'd love to play with you again tomorrow, but something will happen tonight that will change everything, said Matt. So you're not only from the future, said Sally, laughing. You're also fortune tellers. Fortune tellers are people who can see into the future. I know it's hard to believe, but in a few hours the Titanic is going to hit an iceberg and sink. We don't want anything to happen to you. Please, please get to a lifeboat when it happens, said Emily. If the ship hits an iceberg, I will, said Sally. If a whale smashes into the ship and pokes a hole through it, I'll get into a lifeboat too. And if a shark leaps out of the water and tries to eat me, I'll run so fast that he won't be able to take even a little bite. I know you think we're making this all up, Sally, but please remember what we told you, Matt said. You two are the funniest and oddest children I've ever met. Don't forget, come to second class and we'll play a game tomorrow. Sally turned and sped down the staircase to second class. What now, said Matt. We have to tell the captain about the iceberg. He's the only person who can stop this ship. Isn't it lucky we're going to have dinner with him? Maybe our luck is changing. Maybe the Titanic's luck is changing too. Now we're at 6:30. Matt and Emily ran over, chapter 7, to the deck chair where Mrs. Brown was seated. She was speaking to an elderly couple. Ah, here you are, said Mrs. Brown. Ida and Isidore, let me introduce you to my 2 young friends, Emily and Matt. I'm sure they've heard of your store, Macy's. Emily's jaw dropped. I love Macy's. I went to visit my cousins in New York and we went shopping there. It's gigantic. I almost got lost in the underwear department. Everyone howled with laughter. I'm delighted you like our store, said Mrs. Strauss, and I'm glad you found your way out of underwear. And I love your parade. I always watch part of it on the news on Thanksgiving, said Matt. We don't have a parade, said Mrs. Strauss. You must be confusing it with another event, said Mr. Strauss. He turned to his wife. But this is an interesting idea, Ida. I must bring it up to my staff when we return home. Matt glanced at Emily. He knew what she was thinking. The Macy's parades probably didn't start until after 1912. That's why Mr. and Mrs. Strauss didn't know about them. And if the Titanic sank, Mr. and Mrs. Strauss might never make it back to their store and be part of any parade or anything. Now, children, it's time we head towards the first-class dining salon and dinner, said Mrs. Brown. She stood up. Salon? Saloon, pardon me, Tien, I said that wrong. Isn't that a bar where people drink liquor? asked Emily. Yes, said Mrs. Brown. It's also what our first-class dining room is called. I'll tell the head waiter to set 2 extra settings at my table. They allow children in the dining saloon, but not a sled, I'm afraid. She winked at Emily and Matt. Can we leave our sled in your stateroom? Asked Emily. Certainly. We'll take the lift to my stateroom. I'll change into comfortable shoes, and then we'll go down for dinner. Ida and Isidore will see you at dinner. With a wave to Mr. and Mrs. Stroud, Emily and Matt followed Mrs. Brown down the deck. She opened a door, and Emily and Matt gasped. There, right in front of them, was the magnificent staircase. There's the staircase there. It was made of oak and wrought iron, and there was a glass dome overhead to let the natural light stream in. A clock was set into the carved wall at the top of the staircase, and a fat cherub stood on a pedestal at the bottom. And that's an angel right there. That's what a cherub is. I've been dreaming of walking down this staircase, said Emily. Well, go ahead. Do it, said Mrs. Brown. Emily raced up to the top of the first landing. She picked up one end of her purple skirt and slowly walked down the stairs. She smiled and waved, and Mrs. Brown and Matt applauded. Then Matt began to sing. Here she comes, Emily Byng, the famous actress from Glenwood. Glenwood? What kind of place is Glenwood? Said an elegantly dressed woman in a long blue silk gown walking behind Emily. The woman was holding the arm of a man in a black suit. Emily stopped walking and blushed. Glenwood is a town in Ontario. The woman sniffed. Oh, Canada. She gave Emily a disapproving look and headed toward a metal door near the staircase. That awful Mrs. Brown must have put the child up to it. Such ridiculous behavior, the woman said to her companion. Before Mrs. Brown or the kids could reply, the metal doors opened and the couple hurried inside. Then the doors clanged shut. Wow, that's the lift, said Matt. It's a fancy elevator. And those people are rude people, said Mrs. Brown. They had no right saying those mean things to you, Mrs. Brown, said Emily. Not everyone on the ship approves of me. Some people think I'm brash and loud, but lovely people like Ida and Isidore Strauss are not swayed by where you come from. They respect who you are as a person. My parents say the same thing, said Emily. They believe it's who you are inside that counts, not how much money you have. There are mean-spirited people with buckets of money on this ship and lovely, thoughtful people who happen to be poor. The Titanic has all kinds of people, said Mrs. Brown. Ah, here's our lift. It will take us to my stateroom. I can't wait to take these shoes off. Why did I let that saleslady in London convince me to buy such uncomfortable shoes? Who cares if they're the height of fashion? Chapter 8, 7 p.m. Emily and Matt placed the sled in a corner of Mrs. Brown's large stateroom. As Mrs. Brown slipped off her shoes, Emily quickly sketched herself parading down the grand staircase. There she is there. So Emily likes to draw. I like your drawing, said Mrs. Brown. Now let's eat a delicious Titanic dinner. The lift dropped them off in front of the dining saloon. Wow, said Emily when they stepped out. Look at the glass dome in here. And check out those fancy windows and those big green chairs, said Matt. 2 people could fit into each of the chairs. 2 people your size, Matt, said Mrs. Brown, chuckling. 1 chair is just right for me. Mrs. Brown headed for a table. Emily and Matt followed. past a table where some men were looking at a menu. Emily nudged Matt in the arm and whispered, "There's our menu." They had just sat down beside Mrs. Brown when a waiter approached. "Pardon me, madam," he said to Mrs. Brown. "I have a note from the captain." Mrs. Brown scanned the note. "I'm afraid the captain didn't realize till this afternoon that a dinner party is being given in his honor in the a la carte restaurant tonight." So they had a number of different restaurants on board this ship. "He promises to join us tomorrow for dinner. Come back again tomorrow, children, and you can talk to him about your important matter." "Tomorrow?" cried Emily. "Tomorrow will be too late." "I know it's disappointing not to speak to the captain tonight. He's charming, and this is his last voyage." Matt gulped. "We know." "Yes, the word is out. He's retiring after this trip, and I know he'll miss the sea." "I like the sea too, as long as I don't have to swim in it," said Mrs. Brown, chuckling. Matt glanced at Emily. They had to warn Mrs. Brown about the iceberg. Swimming in the sea might be a real possibility soon. "Mrs. Brown," said Emily, "if the ship hits an iceberg tonight, don't wait. Head for the lifeboats, okay?" Mrs. Brown patted Emily on the shoulder. "If something like that was to happen, my dear, I'd jump into a lifeboat quicker than a frog into a pond. I have no intention of swimming to New York. I'd even row the lifeboat myself." You children have probably been reading books about disasters at sea. Don't worry, nothing like that will happen here. Eat your dinner. The food on this ship is out of this world. Despite the delicious food, Emily and Matt could barely eat. They couldn't stop thinking that in a few hours the Titanic was going to sink, and no matter how hard they tried, no one believed them. Not Lou or Hilda Slater or Sally or Mrs. Brown. No one. And now they couldn't even speak to Captain Smith, the one person who really mattered. They couldn't leave dinner to look for him either. It would be rude to Mrs. Brown. But they had to find the captain, and soon. "Come on, you two, eat," Mrs. Brown coaxed them. "Each course here is tastier than the last, and the dessert is the next course." Emily's eyes lit up. "I'll have some dessert. I could never miss that." The waiter brought the desserts out. The eclairs looked as scrumptious as Emily and Matt imagined. They tasted as scrumptious too. Emily and Matt ate every bite. "Now that's the spirit," said Mrs. Brown. "Enjoy yourself today. I always say, who knows what tomorrow will bring." Matt gulped. Mrs. Brown didn't realize how true her words were going to be. Everything would change on the Titanic in just a few hours. No one's life would ever be the same. So we'll leave it, and then we're at 9, chapter 9. It's 9 p.m., so we'll finish this tomorrow, and we'll see. And we know what happens, but we'll read about it. So now you know about icebergs, and they're very cold, Tian, because it's like ice, right? So I hope you had a good day today, and I hope you had lots of fun with your friends and your mom and dad, and learned some things in school. Or maybe you didn't have school today. Yes, I think you did. So lots of hugs and lots of kisses, and we'll see you tomorrow, and we'll finish this book.